Good evening, everybody. So this homily is not based exclusively on the readings for this Sunday. I have also accounted for the readings of the last 2 Sundays. And there's a rationale behind my composition of the homily that way, because there is a unity in these readings that make me look at all these readings together. And I think there are some lessons that we can draw from them. Just in the gospel readings, for example, this is from the 13th chapter of Matthew. And there are 8 parables in this chapter. And these parables form the unity of the 13th chapter of Matthew. And really, there are so many lessons we can draw from them. And then also, similarly, in today's first reading, we have the story of Solomon, but last week's reading was also from the book of wisdom. So I want to provide some common themes for reflection from all these readings. Now, I have 3 points that I'm going to make as usual, and these 3 points are not necessarily connected. I'm not trying to give a coherent homily that flows from one point to the other. I have 3 themes. Pick any one of these or take all 3 with you. Perhaps they'll offer us reflection for the coming week. So first, God is a giver. In today's first reading, God appeared to Solomon in a dream and gave him the opportunity to ask for something. If God asked me, my God, Powerball is $1 billion, probably I would say, dear God, I want to save the world. But that's not what Solomon asked for. Solomon asked for an understanding heart. But God gave him much more than what he asked for. Now, generally, preachers would focus today on Solomon and his good nature. That he was the kind of guy who was humble, who knew what was truly needed for him to be king. I'm trying to not talk about that. But for me, this story tells me something important about God. It tells me that God is a giver. God is not a taker. God is a giver. Throughout human and salvation history, God is a giver. Creation and everything in it, human life and everything that comes with it, are all given to us by God. God is not just a giver, God is a generous giver. God gave Solomon much more than what he asked for. Now, if you remember, a couple of weeks back, I reflected on the parable of the sower and the seed as a parable of God's generosity. I interpreted the seeds falling on different kinds of soils as a sign of God's generosity, and I drew that from what we know historically about a Palestinian farmer who was poor. He did not have seeds to throw onto soil that would not give him fruit. And particularly because a Palestinian farmer sowed seeds with his hands, he would make sure that the seeds fell on fertile soil which would give him optimum yield. But God, I said, who lets the rain fall on the good and the bad, and the sun shine on the just and the unjust, lets the seeds generously fall on different kinds of soil. Even last week, we heard how God allows the weeds to grow alongside the wheat. It's a sign of God's patience and God's capacity for tolerance. And I remember saying this in my last Sunday's homily, that God is a God of second, third, and endless chances. God is a generous God. God gave wisdom to Solomon, but to us, God has given the greatest gift of all, Jesus. Today's second reading says, "For those he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son." That's Jesus. "Those he predestined, he also called, and those he called, he also justified, and those he justified, he also glorified." In other words, heaven itself has been given to us. God constantly gives, and God gives generously. Often in life, and this is my practical implication for you, take this with you if you wish. Often in life, we lose perspective of God's gifts to us. Our focus can be on that which we still do not possess. That would be unwise. I'm proposing that this week we pray and focus on God, the giver. I pray wisdom leads us there. Secondly, I want to talk about God's judgment. In fact, my point is judgment is God's. Over the last 2 weekends and this weekend, we have heard 6 parables. 2 of them particularly caught my attention. The parable of the wheat and the weeds, and the parable of the fishes in the net, which we just heard. In the first parable, weeds grew in the field where the farm owner only sowed wheat. Now the workers in the field wanted to weed out the weeds. However, the owner wanted them to wait until harvest to separate the weeds from the wheat. In today's parable of the various kinds of fish in the net, Jesus compared the separation of the good and the bad fish to the end times, when the righteous will be separated from the wicked. So this teaches me a very, very important lesson. Very important lesson. Final judgment belongs to God. God is the one who separates the wicked from the righteous. And like the workers in the field, I am often tempted to judge people, to separate the good from the bad without knowing them or really understanding their lives, and condemn them. And this for me as a priest is something I have to always caution myself against and watch against. I know people's lives because they have shared their lives with me. Sometimes I sit in the confessional, I hear people's lives, and how easy it is for me to say good versus bad and judge and condemn people. The parables tell me that the final judgment is not mine to make. Final judgment is God's prerogative. What is my job? My job is to toil hard in God's field and leave the final judgment to God. And perhaps the lesson that is for me is something that you could reflect on for yourself in your own lives. And finally, I want to talk about God's gifts that can be lost. See, Solomon was only the 3rd king of Israel. Despite the wisdom given to him, Solomon acted foolishly and became unfaithful to God. First, he became unfaithful to God in 2 ways. First, he employed the Canaanites as forced labor or as slaves, and in this way did what the Egyptians had done to the Israelites. And now he, as an Israelite, was doing that to another people. So that's the first. The second is he took about 700 wives and 300 concubines. Most of them were from the neighboring cultures. To please them, he erected altars to alien gods in violation of the first commandment. Some of these shrines, Solomon personally saw and implemented them. Now, Solomon's actions finally led to the division of the kingdom of Israel into 2, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And the questions we ask is, how could Solomon be so foolish? What happened to the wisdom God gave him? What happened to his understanding heart? Folks, there is a lesson for us in this tragic story. God is a giver. However, we can lose it all because of our foolishness. For example, our foolishness is destroying God's gift of creation. It's our foolishness. Or we who receive God's generous forgiveness can then begin to play God and judge and condemn other people. Or, unlike the merchant who traded his fine pearls for the pearl of great price, we can lose focus on God's kingdom and put all our energy into worldliness. Or, having received God's gifts, we can refuse to live generously ourselves. Or, like Solomon, who did not heed God's commandments and not be guided by the wisdom of God, we too can ignore Christ's life, the message that he brings, the wisdom that comes from his life and teachings, and be foolish. Reflect on this week as you go home. What are God's gifts to me that I might risk losing because of my foolishness? This Eucharist that we celebrate is a gift. Through the Eucharist, we receive the greatest gift God has given us, Jesus. Jesus has a title. His name is the Wisdom of God. So as we receive Christ and the wisdom that comes from him and his life, I pray that we will live wisely. People of God said, Amen.